Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Heather Aliano, and I'm the Communications Director for the One America movement. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Candid Conversations. Candid Conversations is a video series where we feature someone from the One America movement network on our show to get candid about the issues affecting folks and communities across the United States and the toxic polarization we're seeing right now in our country. We've been covering issues related to the pandemic, race, divisions, the election, food insecurity, health disparities, mental health, and so much more. Today, joining us is Destiny Aman for a conversation about resiliency and communication in a crisis. Destiny is a human environment geographer who studies how people perceive, communicate, and respond to the world around them. She uses behavioral science to understand human behavior and to promote healthy, resilient adjustments to environmental risks like hurricanes, floods, and wildfires. Welcome, Destiny.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad you're here. Your job title and job description is so exciting and so very, very nerdy. I studied social science in college and went through all of the geography stuff, and I was not the best at it. So I'm thrilled that we have an expert with us today. So you're currently working as a human environment geographer at HWC, a company that was created to find authentic purpose in working together to change the world for good. Can you tell us a little bit more about that work you do and what is a human environmental geographer?
Sure. Human environment geographers do work it is related to problems that occur at the intersection of people and the environment. For me, that looks like natural hazards, climate change, environmental, public health. But to be a good human environmental geographer, you really do have to know a lot about people and a lot about the environment. So it's a great field for people who can't pick easily what they want to do because they're so excited about everything. It's a very synthetic discipline, so it's kind of like history in that way, where you learn a lot about a lot of different things, and the relationships between those things matter, particularly for geography over space. So how things look different here versus here, and how certain spaces are created and maintained to support certain structures and systems. So for my purposes, I'm a disaster nerd, and I grew up in Northern California, so I've had my share of experiences there, and I wanted to help people, particularly as they deal with problems at that intersection. At HWC, my work looks a lot like kind of understanding how people interact with their environment and how that interaction affects their behavior. So I've done like risk communications work with the National Flood Insurance Program, trying to promote flood insurance coverage nationwide. I've done work research on wildfire perception and how to find new ways to encourage folks to adapt to wildfire in the West, and just generally understanding how people interact with risks in their environment, and how to promote good, healthy responses to those risks.
Of course, and I mean, right now, California is really experiencing a lot of problems with the wildfires. Do you have family still in the area? Are they safe right now?
I do. In fact, just this wildfire season, I've had my parents be evacuated. Actually, up in Oregon, they have the Santiam Canyon fires there. Were very, very scary. They moved super quickly in the middle of the night, so they had to evacuate. And I also still have friends and family down in Sonoma County in the wine country in Northern California. Folks who have been evacuated there, as has been the case now for every year for the last several years in those areas. So.
I have family there as well, so we'll keep your family in these fires in our thoughts and prayers right now. Hopefully we can get that under control soon. So behavioral science, it informs a lot of the environmental risk work that you do around how people interact with the world. We also use behavioral science in our work here at the One America to inform our work as it relates to people responding to different social situations and how polarization happens. The coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated some of our worst issues like homelessness, unemployment, food insecurity, and it's also polarizing us quite a bit as we work through this pandemic. Can you tell us a little bit from a behavioral science standpoint why we're seeing these changes at this point in time with this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, for starters, let me say that behavioral science, the questions you're asking are very sort of big picture questions, and behavioral science is a specific set of tools and research that helps us understand how things happen, sometimes at very small scales in people's minds, and then how they interact with others, and how all those influences compound. I think that it's interesting because looking at the pandemic and everything that's happened and how it's exposed some of the stuff for some folks, underlying or exacerbated vulnerabilities that were already there. One thing that comes to mind for me is that I look at a lot in my work is the impact of fear, because I do a lot of work in situations where we're talking about, crisis or disaster or hazards. And communication in those moments, I'm very interested in sort of how fear can either sort of enable or constrain people's decision making within those moments, right? I think we generally understand that fear intuitively, like we understand that fear is very powerful, and people want to sort of harness it from a communications perspective for good, but it does do certain things to us sort of biologically. It actually can. It's a focusing mechanism, sort of first and foremost. It actually sort of, what happens inside us when we are afraid is very, very physical and very real. It can make us zero in on certain things and block out other things. These are all sort of evolutionary things that have helped us to survive over a long time. So even just understanding what's happening to people when they are afraid, and how that changes their behavior for good or otherwise, can help us as communicators be more careful about how that tool gets wielded during times when people are afraid, or how to work around it when we have to. So
that's so true. And what's really interesting about this time in our nation is we see people using that fear, rather than to bring us together and to get us through this period. They're using that fear to scare us and to divide us even further. So it's really an interesting thing to see play out.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to me is that there's actually relatively recent research to suggest that, we know that when people are afraid, when they're exposed to fearful ideas and concepts, that they are generally display less empathetic behavior toward others. But more recently, we've learned that specifically they tend to display less empathetic behavior toward out-group folks. So they, I think this confirms really one of the most powerful elements of fear as a tool for communication and whatnot, because if people can make us afraid, then we may actually be less likely to join together with other groups. And I think we've seen this throughout history, right? Like even just in terms of, I mean, I'm just thinking about like the social construction of race, for example, and how we've had there are very specific moments in history where people really sought purposefully to divide people into different categories and to make us afraid of one another. And doing so actually can kind of create this self-fulfilling cycle, particularly if you can sort of essentialize those characteristics and make people think that they're not really coming from somewhere else, but they're actually natural and just the way things are. And I think that we're seeing a lot of that even today in terms of how people are relating to each other in the case of the pandemic, around sort of divisions and sort of solidifying people into camps and setting one another against each other. And we're seeing the impact of that now.
Right. This isn't in one of the questions that we pre-discussed, but I'm wondering now that I hear you talking about this, do you see a place where we can change this behavior in our country at this point? What would we need to change about that communication to start bringing us together instead of fighting through the pandemic?
Right. So, I mean, one of those things, I'm a nerd for this stuff. So obviously I'm going to go toward like, first we have to understand how these things are affecting us. And I do think that as somebody who understands these concepts, in order to create messages that will help people be safer and more resilient, you first have to understand, like, if there is a fear-based approach coming your way, where is it coming from and why? And to just get kind of, find a space of understanding within that too. Like, who is this coming from, and who benefits from this message or this application of fear? And then from there, I think, hopefully folks can understand that we have a lot of these things are not just interpersonal. They've been baked into our systems. They've been baked into our community structures, and we need to be able to spot them where we see those potential impacts. And so there's a personal element in terms of a promotion of points of connection and people being able to understand one another as humans, as individuals, that empathy piece to counteract that fear. And there's certainly community structures that folks are finding to be able to find those, points of connection, be it churches or community elements or other places. But I do think that it's almost like, if you think about it, like, if empathy is the antidote to division, because if people understand one another as true human beings and people of a kind, and fear is sort of a kryptonite for empathy, then you need to understand sort of how other places of division are at play to understand why and where people are coming from fear, and how we might understand and neutralize that fear through, deployment of interpersonal and structural and community-based sorts of, interactions and strategies.
Absolutely. I'm so glad to hear you talk about this. Next week on Candid Conversations, we're actually bringing somebody on to talk about that media literacy piece and how to figure out who is giving you the message and why they're giving you that message. So we'll dig into that more next week. And then also, you had mentioned having that empathy. So one of the tools we have at One America is this guide for how do you talk to your neighbor, and how do you get into these conversations that allow you to fully understand the depth of somebody's perspective and life experiences, so we can work through issues by relating to one another with empathy, rather than just giving our own talking points and ignoring the other side. So I want to dig in a little bit deeper and a little more specifically into this communication that we're seeing. So as a fellow communications nerd myself, I was really excited to see that you wrote an article about the science of fonts, which is something that maybe the average person doesn't think too much about. But in your article, you talk about how something seemingly as simple as choosing a font could undermine the credibility of a product or a message. Have you seen this play out at all throughout this pandemic and election year and the communications that we're receiving as Americans? And are there other subliminal things that might be out there in the environment that are affecting how we perceive the world?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's hard. It's actually hard to when you see how these things kind of line up to try to affect people's decision making and their behavior. It's kind of hard not to see it, even if you might want to, depending on where you go. I have had a number of pretty in-depth debates with people about fonts and serifs and silly things like that. But it's amazing how those little things can actually stack up to influence us. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind here is that the harmony between sort of the message and the medium is very important. So like, if you want to take something seemingly small, like color is a great example of that, right? Like, colors actually have a biological impact on us in terms of our response to them. The color of red is, the color of blood. It's the color of fire, right? Like, we actually have a biological response of alert when we see red. It's the reason why our stop signs are red and not, green. And then, blues and greens are much more soothing, which is why, like, the flyers at the spa are blue and green and sort of soothing colors. So it's that, like, where you put the message in context, though, that can matter even more so. So for example, like, if you're thinking about basic stuff, like if you were making an infographic, for instance, and when we do this visual communication stuff, you would never want to put like the riskiest actions of a COVID-19 infographic in blue, right? And then have the less risky stuff be in red. You want it to be sort of intuitive, and you want the message to fit the to sort of fit that context. But you can overdo this as well. So for instance, I've done a lot of research on sort of wildfire communication, and out there. I mean, wildfire, for better or for worse, it's very photogenic. It's something we naturally, look at. We want to attend to it. And so a lot of times what will happen is communicators will use fire. Wildfire communicators will use fire in their brochures and their flyers and stuff like that. These sort of like these flames and these sort of burned out hillsides and stuff as a way to try to get attention, which it does do. But you can overdo that as well. So for instance, in my research, I found in interviewing residents and whatnot that I was actually doing work up in Lake Tahoe area where a lot of people have like second homes and things, and they'll go up to try to like escape for the weekend and have this sort of peaceful forest experience. And they're getting this, flyer in the mail that's got, burned out hillsides, flames, and all that sort of thing. And I asked people, like, what did you do with this literature when you received it? And almost everybody said I chucked it right away because I didn't want that sitting around on my coffee table in front of my beautiful view, scaring the bejesus out of me. So when we think about harmony with the message and context, we also have to think about sort of the audience's context and when will they see this message and how might they respond to it differently if they receive it in one place or another, or with one particular sort of design element or another. So one of the things I recommended to folks in that case, to wildfire communicators, is to, if you're trying to reach homeowners, especially second homeowners, see if you can find a way to include that information about what to do to prevent wildfires, normalize it a little bit more. Instead of having it be this big, scary thing, have it be something that gets included with your homeowners association, like how to winterize your house binder, when you get your new resident and you're learning how to live in the woods. Fire is part of that. And we're just going to, do these things because that's what it means to live in the woods, not necessarily because everything is going to, burn up in an apocalyptic hellscape. The truth is, it is doing that, and it can happen that way. But people don't always respond to those messages the way that we expect them to, and we need to be conscious of that and not necessarily, reach out to those folks in the ways we think might be the biggest and loudest ways.
That's really helpful. I think there are a lot of people, not just in communications, but people who work at nonprofits or churches or schools who have to put out this information, and they can think about how they're presenting it so it's received the best. So that's really helpful. I'd like to pivot a little bit in this conversation towards what people like I could do if I'm receiving these messages. So instead of delivering, receiving, it's no wonder right now that people are so overwhelmed with so many different things going on, and there's a bunch of things coming at us that change how we see the world. So you did a great interview in Psychology Today where you discussed cultivating resilience in the midst of a crisis by preparing in advance. So speaking of preparing for the future, I know we're right now in the middle of a crisis of the pandemic, but we're also a few short weeks away from an election, which has people feeling all sorts of overwhelm and anxiety and worry and hope, excitement maybe. Election seasons come with all sorts of feelings. But as we are feeling uncertain and discomfort as we navigate this time, is there anything that we can do as Americans to prepare ourselves for both election day and the time that follows?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna sort of link together, hopefully, a little bit of what we just discussed with regard to kind of design and communications, because one of the things we have to consider from a pandemic perspective with communicating to people now, and with an election perspective too, the idea of sort of harmony and context and considering how people are going to be receiving your message and where they are, there very much is, a concept of sort of fear fatigue. Like people, what we experience as fear is a biological thing that happens in our brains, and we can deplete our sort of, our physical response to that can be depleted, and we can have different kinds of responses to things over time. And so, for example, one of the things to keep in mind with regard to going into the election in a pandemic is that people are exhausted, mentally exhausted in ways that for many of us, they've never been so exhausted before. And that's in part because they're having the degree of uncertainty that we have right now with the virus that we don't know much about, and with risk factors that are, sort of we're lucky if we have anything firm to say about them in all these various contexts. What it means is that most people day to day actually make decisions based on sort of their intuition, their routine, their values. They don't spend time agonizing day to day over like, am I going to take this exit or that exit? They just know they're going to take this one way to work, and that's how they do it, right? They don't agonize over exactly how they're going to tie their shoes, right? There's just we would be paralyzed if we had to actually think about things as like a pro and con for every single decision. But unfortunately, that is exactly what we are having to do now, right? We're having to decide, are we leaving today? Where am I going? How much risk is going to be involved in this decision? Am I going to put these people at risk? And it is, if you feel exhausted mentally, it's because your brain is actually working much, much, much harder on the course of a given day than it typically does, because we don't have those routines and everything to help us kind of guide our decision making. So moving into layering that on top of an election, and that's going to, deplete people emotionally that much more. And so what happens at the end really is hopefully an amplified version of what you often hear people say during these situations, which is, first, self-care is like the big thing these days, right? But there's actually been some really good work done on encouraging people to think a little more broadly, because most of what people talk about when they talk about self-care, like eating ice cream or, taking bubble baths or binging on Netflix or something like that, is actually self-soothing. It's not really self-care. Self-care is the stuff that we're doing that is actually like helping us to be healthier. It's meditating, it's journaling, it's exercising. It's all the stuff we don't really want to do when we're in that space. We just want to eat the ice cream, but is really good for us in the long run. But even beyond that, there are other elements around community care and structural care. Community care are the things that, help us to get more long-term support. So things like childcare and healthcare collectives and supporting one another, with freeing up time in that way, or helping people get their healthcare or the mental health care in particular that they need, or skill sharing and mutual aid programs. So being able to plan ahead and invest and think about, like, who do I know? What organizations am I a part of? What am I contributing to? But also, where can I ask for help? And in sort of addressing these issues sort of at my community level. And then, of course, the structural level around how do we make sure that our systems and whatnot are built, restructured in ways that promote healthcare, structural elements, justice for everybody, so that there's much more there than just for us in terms of options than just like, the ice cream bucket, right? So those are some things I think about.
Oh my gosh, that might have been the nicest thing that I've heard so far in this pandemic, is like, if you're exhausted, there's a reason for it. Like, we're not broken right now. Our brains are going through a lot. So being kind to yourself, I appreciate that. And obviously, I have indulged in a lot of self-soothing and not enough self-care. So we will definitely start to focus on making some better choices to get through this. That's really helpful advice. So as we conduct these interviews with Candid Conversations, we do talk about some really hard issues and scary issues, but we really like to end on a high note and to talk about our hope for the future, because most Americans, when we're in this hard place, we still see light at the end of the tunnel, and we want good things for our country and good things for our families. So as we look forward past this election season and this pandemic, what hopes do you have for our country and for our future?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I feel like the other aspect of the exhaustion that people are facing is that it's hard to even think farther ahead than just day to day, right? Which is partly why it feels like we're in a time warp too, that we don't know what day it is, because there's no reference point to kind of help us stay steady. I think one thing that happened for me recently that gave me some hope, in terms of, it was actually kind of a nexus of some different elements of nerdery for me. But my church actually recently, I serve on our executive council, and we had to write our COVID-19 outdoor sort of policies for use of our grounds. Our building has been closed since March, so we're not having services and stuff. Everything has been virtual so far, but we have beautiful grounds, and folks have been really wanting to try to find a way to have some interaction, even if it's in small groups or something like that. And so the team really took a lot of time to try to be thoughtful about how to design these guidelines so that we could allow some access to the degree that we felt like if people felt like they wanted to kind of take that risk, what was the risk that we felt comfortable with, what was the risk that others did, what were people hoping to get out of the experience. And of course, people's concerns around risk and their varying degrees of sort of their own profile or their family's profile there. And just by nature of doing that in that conversation required a lot of thinking about things from everybody else's perspective, right? And that is not what we're seeing on the news every day, especially when it comes to the pandemic, right? And so just seeing how folks, and this is kind of gets back to our conversation about empathy, because where we can find those sort of community organizations that put us in touch with different kinds of people, and where we can develop relationships with those people and see them and love them as people first, then it's less about sort of, you know, all of those messages that are really about division. They don't really work because we already know that that's not our experience, right? And that we care about this person and we want them to be able to access, or we want them to be able to feel safe or whatnot. And so as it turned out, it took us a while, a lot of difficult conversations and whatnot. But on Sunday, we unanimously passed the new policies, which, I mean, we weren't expecting that at all, given the contentiousness of everything these days and the fear and everything that's around everything. So it really brought me back to this idea that like we have to understand as communicators, but also just people, if we really want to promote connection, we have to understand what matters to others. Like we have to be able to really just, invest in learning what we can and caring about what other people care about in order to really connect with them. And that's kind of how it shook out for us. We haven't had a chance to test it out yet, and maybe things will change and, we'll have to kind of revise as we go, but it definitely gave me some hope, because I feel like if the country could do that, we would be on pretty solid ground.
Absolutely. One of the commenters put in, "We're not broken right now." And I think that speaks to what you're saying. What we're trying to do here is recognizing that like, this isn't the end. We're not broken. We're still here. We can lean on each other. I really like that as a closing thought. Well, unfortunately, we're just about out of time. That flew by because it was so much fun. Thank you again for joining us. So before we head out, where can people find you if they want to connect with you more about this sort of stuff?
Yeah, I have a LinkedIn page. I mentioned I was trying to get my website up, but I didn't quite make it in time. So LinkedIn is definitely the best place to find me these days. And I'm happy to, folks have questions or they're curious about the work that we're doing at HWC or any of this research or whatnot, want to talk more. I'm happy to talk more.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. Okay, everybody. So before you click off of this live stream, please do make sure you check out our website at theoneamericamovement.org. You can also find us on Facebook, which is probably where you're watching this, and on Twitter at One America Movement, which is MVMT for Twitter. Make sure you tune in weekly for Candid Conversations. Next week, as we said, we're going to be having a conversation around media literacy and how to navigate this difficult world on social media. And until next time, enjoy your weekend, and thank you so much for watching.